Commander Replay, we take a look at the red cards from Kaldheim and talk about which ones are best. Next on Commander Replay. Welcome back, everyone. Today we are talking about Kaldheim spoilers, and in particular, we are talking about red. So, over the past couple years, red has gotten a lot of really cool cards. That trend continues in Kaldheim. There's a lot of cards that I really like. Oh, and by the way, I'll only be talking about cards that have been officially spoiled. I did see there's a couple leaked cards that do look really cool, but we're not going to talk about those today. So with that, let's get into it. First up, we have the God of Thunder himself, Thor, aka Torolf, God of Fury. So on his front side, he's a 4-mana 5/4 with Trample that says, whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Torolf deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. So that looks really cool. We'll talk about it in a second. Let's talk about the backside real quick. Torolf's Hammer. It's a 2-mana equipment, and it's 2 mana to equip. It says, equipped creature has 1 in a red, tap that creature, unattach Torolf's Hammer, it deals 3 damage to any target. Then, return Torolf's Hammer to its owner's hand, and equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary. So this card is really, really cool. It took me a little while to actually digest this card, and the more that I look at it, the more that I like it. So let's talk about why. Talking about Torolf's front side as a creature, the big thing here is that if you play a Blasphemous Act and there's a bunch of creatures on the table for your opponents, you probably just won the game. Red board wipes are going to be very good with Torolf, and personally, I've been looking for a commander where I can just play all of the red board wipes, and I think this is going to be the one. So obviously things like Blasphemous Act, Magma Quake, Chain Reaction, anything that's red and does lots of damage to all the creatures, gonna be really, really good. You may want to consider a card like Forbidden Orchard, just to help give your opponents some creatures. And finally, the last thing you might want to consider, some Indestructible or some pro-red swords, just to be able to protect your own stuff from the board wipes. But Torolf plus Blasphemous Act sounds like a winner to me. A lot of good things are going to happen, and what's cool too is that that's not a lot of cards. That leaves the rest of your deck to do whatever else you want. So I do think Torolf is going to be very powerful, and the more I keep looking at this, especially because of how much Blasphemous Act is played, I think this is the type of thing that you're going to put this in any mono red deck, probably going to go in a lot of Boros decks. I think it's just going to end up in a lot of decks. To me, it looks very powerful, and that's not even talking about the backside. On the backside, we see the Hammer, and the Hammer is repeatable removal, which is really, really cool because it's going to give you a really easy way to get rid of opponent's value creatures. Like, if you see an Oracle of Moldiah on the other side of the board, that's a perfect target as something you would want to hit with the Hammer. As far as I understand it, it's the Hammer dealing the damage, not the creature. I did ask this on Twitter. So, Death Touch isn't going to help you here, but you could use something like a damage doubler if you are wanting to kill bigger targets, and red decks like their damage doublers anyway, so if you're doing 6 damage to a target, now you're taking Titans off the board. So I heard some people say they were a little bit disappointed with the Hammer. I think the Hammer is going to be very good. It's repeatable removal, and the fact that it brings itself back to its hand may seem like a downside at first, but there is a lot of upside to that also, which is that 1, it's going to make it hard to kill if they don't have a Crossing Grip, because you just return the Hammer the second they try to shoot it. But also, returning the Hammer to your hand then gives you the ability to recast it as Torolf on the creature side. That's a lot of flexibility. If you somehow get to a point where you're like, well, I don't need the Hammer anymore, let's bring it back to the hand, now get this creature, that's incredible with like half the red cards ever printed. So I think Torolf is going to be a really, really powerful card. It's also aggressively costed. It's a lot of things. It's a beefy creature that comes down early. It gives you an ability that can just win the game. And on the backside, it gives you repeatable removal and a lot of flexibility to kind of choose which mode you need in that moment. So I think this is going to be a really sweet card. Moving on from that, we see Magda Brazen Outlaw. 2 mana for a 2/1. It's a legendary dwarf berserker. Other dwarves you control get +1/+0. Whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token. Then, sacrifice 5 treasures. Search your library for an artifact or dragon card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. That is huge. So for a very long time, I've been saying that red needs a Fabricate, and you might have to jump through a few more hoops, but this is essentially that. There's a lot of good things happening on this card. 1, if you're looking to run Dwarf Tribal, which I know some people are, this is going to be a very good commander to do it. 2, this commander helps you make mana, which is also really sweet. And we'll talk about how to use that ability a little bit more in a moment. And then finally, that search ability is really, really good. So there's a dragon in this set that's gonna pair really well with the treasure tokens. So that is also a thing, beside the fact that there's a million other awesome dragons in Magic. Or get the artifact you need, get an equipment, put that onto the battlefield, and go ham with an Argentum Armor or Blackblade Reforged, whatever you need in that moment, you can go get. So this is a really, really cool card. Let's take a look at a few ways to really take advantage of it. The first thing, if you have some dwarves on the battlefield, extra combats are going to be really good. Mirage, Relentless Assault, Savage Beating. Besides just doing a lot of damage with your dwarves, also going to give you a lot of extra mana to keep doing other stuff afterwards. If you look at stuff like Waves of Aggression in a Boros deck, or Aggravated Assault, the dwarves are going to give you additional mana, so as long as they're not dying in combat, and maybe you want to consider a Dolmen Gate, or a Bedlam, or something like that, then, especially with Aggravated Assault, you're going to be able to go infinite. If you're talking about it in a Boros deck, Waves of Aggression won't necessarily go infinite, but still the ability to squeeze off a second, third, or fourth combat is really, really powerful, and usually enough to take one or more players out of the game. And then finally, we see some cards like Paradise Mantle and Springleaf Drum, which give you the ability to tap your dwarves without attacking with them, in addition to making some mana, so I think those are also going to be very good for this type of deck. And one final thing, Mag does 2 mana. I don't know if any of you have ever played a 2-mana commander before. I played Ashling for years and years. Having your commander come in on turn 2 is just really good. You look at your opening hand, you're like, well, I've got 2 lands, I can cast my commander, at least I can do something. It's a really good thing when you can do that. It adds this level of consistency to your deck that you're like, well, I know my turn 2 play is probably going to be my commander a lot of the times. And if you want to start messing around with stuff like Sword of the Animist and Mask of Memory, Dowsing Dagger, those type cards, being able to have early access to a creature and specifically your commander is all going to be really good stuff. So another card that looks super sweet. Moving on from that, we see Goldspan Dragon. So if you were playing Standard, this is probably the dragon that you would go get, as it has synergy with the treasure tokens. But let's take a look at it. It's a 5-mana 4/4 with flying and haste. Whenever it attacks or becomes the target of a spell, create a treasure token. And it says, treasure tokens you control have tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 2 mana of any one color. Essentially, your treasure tokens make double now. This is another card. The more I look at it, the more I like this card. So, if you think about what a Dark Ritual does, a Dark Ritual is a 1-mana card that gives you 2 additional mana. This thing is essentially spitting out Dark Rituals every time it attacks or gets targeted. So if this thing stays on the battlefield for just a couple turns, it's going to make you a good amount of extra mana. And extra mana is what allows you to get ahead and eventually win the game. So, like, you're not necessarily going to win the game with Goldspan Dragon, it's going to set you up for the thing that is going to win the game. And because of that, I do think people will undervalue this card a bit for at least a little while. But the more I've been thinking about it, the more I'm like, this is kind of like mini Neheb. It's not quite as ridiculously strong as Neheb, but that's okay, because Neheb is an absurd Magic card. Being like 50% of a Neheb is still completely awesome, so I think Goldspan Dragon is the type of card that you can put into a lot of different decks. I think this is another card that you can put in almost any red deck and it's going to be pretty good. But let's talk about a few things that are really going to like Goldspan Dragon. First up, Feather the Redeemed is really going to like Goldspan Dragon. I don't want to use the word infinite, but you will be able to cast a lot of spells. I do think that Goldspan Dragon will essentially be a win condition for Feather, or a thing that gets you to your win condition, because it's going to make a lot of mana and it's going to allow you to cast a lot of spells. And one of the things Feather does struggle with is making enough mana to be able to cast all your spells as many times as you want to. It's a really mana-hungry deck, and I think Goldspan Dragon is going to be incredible in there. Similar to Feather, Zada is also really going to like this, again giving you additional mana. Both Zada and Feather want a lot of the same things, so no surprise that you'll probably be seeing the dragon in both of those decks. Just like we talked about with the dwarves, this card makes mana when it attacks, which means it's going to be really good with Waves of Aggression and Aggravated Assault. It won't immediately go infinite with either, but still, if you're getting most of your cost paid for another Aggravated Assault, it's that same concept of you don't need to go infinite, but still, if you have 4 combats in a row, players are going to die. So it's going to be really good for that type of thing. And of course, if you want to mess around with treasure token synergies, Brass's Bounty is a card that I've been seeing a lot lately that can be very good. Smothering Tithe is obviously very strong. Probably game-breaking, actually. If you have like I don't know, 3 or 4 treasures off of Smothering Tithe that are all making double. I imagine that you'll be casting most of your hand at that point and or trying to refill your hand, and you'll just be way ahead of your opponents. So yeah, Goldspan Dragon looks really, really cool. Really excited about this one. Again, I think you can put this in just about every red deck because mana is what wins games, and this makes mana for you. And as we saw on the other page, that a lot of Boros synergies with this thing, so that also makes me very excited about it. Moving on from that, we've got Tybalt's Trickery. This card is also really exciting. Let's take a read. It's 1 and a red, counter target spell. Let me repeat that one. Counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. There's a lot of words on here, but there are some important ones, which are the first ones, which say counter target spell. After that, you get into what is essentially a Chaos Warp counterspell for red. They're gonna get a spell back, but in the same way that you use Chaos Warp, the thing you're getting rid of is so much worse than the thing that they are likely to get. Same thing with Rapid Hybridization, same thing with Skyclave Apparition, and many of the other, I destroy this thing, they still get something back, but the thing they're getting back is way less scary than the thing you're getting rid of. This is an unbelievably powerful effect in red. This is an instant, which also means it's a Sunforger target, so I'll probably be running this. Because you want to know what I hate losing to? The big spells. Craterhoof Behemoth, Expropriate, and Torment of Hailfire, I hate losing to that stuff. Craterhoof and Torment especially, I don't run into Expropriate or Insurrection all that often. But this is a beautiful answer to cards like that. In the middle, we see some other impactful cards that you may want to counter. Turnabout usually means that they're trying to set up for big mana to go for their combo win. Austere Command if they're blowing up all your stuff. Zendikar Resurgent because it's insane, and they usually end up like drawing and playing most of their deck. And then, of course, I do think there are CEDH ramifications for this card as well. Countering a Thassa's Oracle, an Ad Nauseam, or a Demonic Consultation means you don't have to lose the game right now, and whatever spell they get back is probably not going to be as bad as the thing you're countering. And you can make it so they don't actually get a second spell. Drannith Magistrate or any of the Rule of Law type effects are going to get you there. I've shown Archon of Emeria just because it's the newest version. So this is going to be a nice tool for Boros CEDH. But also probably just most red decks. This thing is really good, and I hope that it doesn't become very expensive because printing a counterspell in another color is a really big deal. I guess Wizards finally got tired of all the memes that Tybalt is bad. Moving on from that, we've got Quakebringer, a 5-mana 5/4 giant berserker that says your opponents can't gain life, and at the beginning of your upkeep, Quakebringer deals 2 damage to each opponent. This ability triggers only if Quakebringer is on the battlefield or if Quakebringer is in your graveyard and you control a giant, and you can foretell it and pay 4 instead of its normal casting cost. So, unlike some of the other cards we looked at, Quakebringer isn't going to go everywhere, but I still think it's a pretty cool card. Obviously, there's a lot of standard ramifications for this card, but I do think it's going to have a home in EDH as well. The big thing I'm thinking about is burn decks. If you're playing a burn deck, the last thing you want your opponents doing is gaining life, and with Heliod, Mangara, and Liesa all coming out within the past year, there's been a lot more life gain decks. So having a creature that can answer that is really nice, in addition to the fact that it can also just do incidental damage to your opponents, so if you get into a board stall for some reason, you're still getting small amounts of damage in. Again, red decks like their damage doublers, and if you're playing burn, you're probably running some of them. So 2 damage becomes 4 damage. That stuff adds up over time, and really cuts down the amount of work that the other cards in your deck need to do. So again, I don't think this is going to go everywhere, but you could certainly do much worse than this. I know that whenever I see an Erebos on the battlefield, it always crushes me and stops me from gaining like 10 or 15 life, and I usually end up losing the game as a result of that. So don't discount that your opponents can't gain life ability, especially with life gain being on the rise. Next up, we have Reckless Crew, a 4-mana sorcery that says create X 2/1 red dwarf berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of vehicles you control plus the number of equipment you control. For each of those tokens, you may attach an equipment you control to it. Kind of a cool little card, so I think its best use case is going to be for vehicle decks. Vehicles, still kind of on the harder to pull off side of Commander. Definitely not a top tier type strategy, but As we keep getting more cards like Reckless Crew, that's definitely going to help to make it more and more playable. And I think this is a cool little card that if you have a bunch of vehicles on the board, now you should be able to crew up all or most of them and go on a big attack. Now, I know it says equipment also on it. I don't think it's a great card for equipment decks. Typically in Commander, your equipment deck's gonna be more Voltron based. If you're doing the equipment thing, you don't really want to spread out too much with the go wide thing. You want to keep your damage kind of focused and usually onto your commander when you can. So I wouldn't necessarily run it for an equipment deck, but it's also not terrible if you do. One thing to keep in mind too is that those are permanent tokens. They don't disappear at the end step like many red cards do, so those will stick around. At the very least, you'll get some blockers out of it. So a cool little card, especially for those looking to run vehicle decks. Next up, we've got Calamity Bearer. 4 mana 3/4, it says, if a giant source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. Very simply, a damage doubler for giants. If you're looking to run giant tribal, you're probably going to put this in there. Most giants have high CMCs. This one's only 4, so that's also really nice. I can't imagine using this if you're not running giant tribal or if your commander is not a giant. Those are probably the only times that I would use this. But for those two type of decks, gonna be pretty solid, I think. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up here. I know there's more red spoilers coming. Perhaps we'll talk about those in the future. But do you think Toralf is gonna go in like every single red deck? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below.